Okay, so our first speaker today is Eamon Cotter. Eamon is an independent archaeologist and researcher with a particular interest in medieval settlements and buildings. Over the past 30 years, he has excavated at a range of medieval castle and church sites and has published numerous journal papers. In 2013, he edited and published Buttevant, a medieval Anglo-French town in Ireland, a collection of papers on the medieval town of Buttevant. More recently, he was the author of Heritage Castles of County Cork, published by Cork County Council. His paper today explores the history and archaeology of Carrigaline Castle. So, over to you, Eamon.
Hello everyone, my name is Eamon Cotter. I'm an archaeologist and I've done some work recently on Carrigaline Castle at the request of Dr. Morgan and Dr. Heffernan, and I would like to thank both of them for the opportunity to give this presentation to this historic conference. So what I propose to do is to look very briefly at the history and the development of the castle and the house, and to place the house in its context of the political and social change in early 17th century Munster. So first of all, we have a look at the map of the area for anybody who's not entirely familiar with it. Here we are on the south coast of Ireland, here Cork Harbour, Cork City here, the harbour, and here's Carrigaline on an estuary just off the harbour. So as you can see, it's an ideal location really for maritime trade and contacts, and well suited, well located for transatlantic commerce between England and Ireland and the new colonies of America in the 16th and 17th century. So look at the site. This is a general view of the site of Carrigaline Castle up here on a prominent rock outcrop in what is otherwise relatively flat landscape, with good views out here towards the estuary and out into the harbour. So what we have here is the two buildings, the medieval castle dating back to the 13th century, and here at the southern end of the site, the 17th century house. It is, as you will see, in a rather sad, neglected state of ruin and densely overgrown. However, its location here on the rocky outcrop has actually protected it from modern development and agricultural activities, so that I would think it retains a high potential for any future archaeological investigation around the site. So we'll just look briefly here at the castle. This is the main structure that survives. This two-story tower. This will probably be close to its original height. A section of it here collapsed in the 1980s, and the remainder is not in great condition. And there were also a range of buildings here along inside the curtain wall, which enclosed the entire area. And looking further south at the house, this is the 17th century house. All we've got left is this southeastern corner. This is what's left of the east wall, and it's obvious that it continued much further to the north here. And the south wall here, again, clearly considered or continued much further to the west. And you see this projecting stonework here is actually part of the original medieval curtain wall. 17th century house was built on top of the medieval curtain wall. So this is my ground plan of the site. Shaded in black here is the medieval masonry. This is the tower which we looked at a moment ago. And here's the curtain wall and a range of buildings, or would have been a range of buildings. You can just see faint traces of them surviving now. Here at the south end, in red, is the 17th century house, which we looked at again a moment ago. So as I said, just a part of the east wall and a short section of the south wall surviving. These two buildings here, cross-hatched, are 19th century farm buildings, two small buildings. It looks like this whole area here was quarried into to create a space for building those two buildings, and I suspect that that quarrying undermined the original what was left of the 17th century house. And this outline here, shaded in blue, is my suggestion of what would have been the ground plan of the original 17th century house. But we'll come back to that again in a moment. So what I want to do now is just give a brief run through the history and development of the castle. It's traditionally said to have been built by Milo de Cogan in the late 12th century. De Cogan was one of the principal Anglo-Norman lords, and Cork, the county of Cork, what was the ancient county of Desmond, which is effectively Cork and Kerry, was divided between Milo de Cogan and another of the great Anglo-Norman lords, Robert Fitzstephen. But when King Henry II divided Cork between these two barons, he retained Cork city and lands around it in his own hands, and these lands included the barony of Carrigaline, of which Carrigaline was the chief manor. So I think it very unlikely that Milo de Cogan would have built a castle on lands which were directly under the control of the king. However, in the early 1200s, King Henry's successor, King John, granted Carrigaline to Philip de Prendergast, another of the great Anglo-Norman barons. Philip passed it to his son Gerald, who held it until his death in or around 1251. And I think it most likely that the castle here was built by one of these Prendergasts, either the father Philip or his son Gerald. Now, when Gerald died in 1251, he died without a male heir. So all his territories, he had lands around County Cork, including Carrigaline, it all passed to his two daughters, and one of them was married to a John de Cogan, and it was she who inherited Carrigaline and passed it to her son, also John de Cogan. So that was the beginning of the Cogan relationship with Carrigaline. Now, the Cogans, as I mentioned earlier, were one of the great Anglo-Norman families. They were also major landholders in Cork County, with lands all across the Lee Valley, almost back as far as Macroom, and stretching up into mid-Cork, almost as far as Mallow. But in the 14th century, their fortunes declined dramatically, and by 1400, they had lost most of their territory, except for Carrigaline, this area around Carrigaline. Eventually, however, in 1439, even that was lost when Robert de Cogan signed away all his lands and claims to James Fitzgerald, the Earl of Desmond. Now, these Desmonds were the most powerful Anglo-Norman dynasty in Ireland, and by far the most powerful in Munster itself. Their principal base was here in Limerick, around Newcastle West and Adair, and their lands stretched across North Kerry and out into the Dingle Peninsula. And over time, they expanded further east here and down into East Cork and Mid Cork and this area here, Carrigaline, around Carrigaline. In addition, they had established a network of alliances across Limerick and Cork, coloured here or shaded in green, and so that nearly all of Limerick, North and East Cork were either directly under their control or were certainly within their sphere of influence. Typically, the Earls of Desmond's outlying possessions were granted as appanages or inheritance to members of the Earl's family, often a brother or cousin of the Earl, who would otherwise have no inheritance. So it was that around the mid-16th century, the Earl of Desmond, the 13th Earl, granted Carrigaline, this area in which Carrigaline is situated, to his brother Maurice. Maurice in turn passed it to his son James Fitzmaurice, and as we shall see, he was to become a very significant figure in Irish history of the 16th century. Around the same time, Gerald, the 14th Earl, was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London for disturbances he had caused around Munster. While in prison, he chose his cousin James Fitzmaurice of Carrigaline to rule the earldom in his absence. Curiously, after choosing James to rule his territories, he then the Earl leased Carrigaline to a new English settler, thereby disinheriting James. St. Leger proceeded to populate Carrigaline and the area around with new English tenants. James, as might be expected, was highly disgruntled and deeply resented this move, but he was now in control of the earldom, and having established his rule over the earldom, he went into rebellion, and his first move was, not surprisingly, to attack the English settlement at Carrigaline and to recover his lands there, which he did in 1569. Now this became a very significant event in Irish history, so that the capture of Carrigaline was effectively the opening move in the first phase of what eventually proved to be a long drawn out brutal rebellion, the Desmond Rebellion, and this in turn was followed by the Munster Plantation, the plantation which brought Daniel Gookin and other English adventurers to Ireland. So faced with Fitzmaurice's rebellion, the Dublin government sent down an army into Munster, recaptured Carrigaline, but the rebellion dragged on for another 3 years or so until Fitzmaurice eventually surrendered. And around that time, as part of an overall deal with the Crown, the Earl was released and came back and resumed control of his lordship. So James was now left with no authority within the lordship, all his lands at Carrigaline still under English control. He was without land, without inheritance, without authority. Embittered, he left for France, where he sought to recruit aid from the Catholic powers of France and Spain to confront Protestant English rule. 4 years later, he returned, accompanied by foreign troops and the papal envoy, and launched another rebellion against the Crown. This time he had more widespread support, and eventually the Earl himself was forced by circumstances to join in the rebellion. So now the final phase of the Great Desmond Rebellion was underway. After 4 years of a bitter, violent guerrilla war, the rebellion ended with the capture and execution of the Earl of Desmond. The suppression of the rebellion was followed by the Munster Plantation. This was a planned government scheme under which the extensive territories of the Earl and his supporters were declared forfeit to the Crown and were granted to loyal English settlers, whom we refer to nowadays as the New English. The Munster Plantation proceeded apace in the 1580s, and the map shows the area planted here. These were all the Desmond territories, which I showed in the previous map, and various other parcels of land, including Carrigaline down here with Carrigaline at its centre. So Carrigaline was now sort of included or folded into the overall Munster Plantation, even though it had previously been settled by St. Leger's tenants, and St. Leger's claim to the land was disputed, a claim which dragged on for several years with years of legal wrangling, but eventually St. Leger was granted title in 1595 to 6,000 acres in Carrigaline. Near the end of the 16th century, the Munster Plantation was largely overthrown by a new rebellion, and the English settlers were driven out. This rebellion in turn was decisively crushed in 1601 by the momentous Battle of Kinsale, which took place down here just southwest of Carrigaline. Kinsale was the most decisive battle in early modern Ireland, and it firmly established English rule over the country, leading to several decades of peace. In its effects, I think it could be compared with the Great Battle of Yorktown, which occurred the following century close to Newport News. Because the big difference was that here at Kinsale, the English won, unlike at Yorktown. Now after Kinsale, very few of the original plantation settlers returned to Munster, and a new wave of settlers began to arrive to take their place. Many of the original settlers sold their lands, as St. Leger did some stage before 1611. He had sold Carrigaline to several settlers, including Richard Boyle, Thomas Petley, and others. Petley, we know, got a grant of the castle, manor, town, and lands of Carrigaline in 1613. He in turn sold within 3 years to Daniel Gookin. Gookin was another New English settler who was already active in the fishing trade along the south coast, around southwest Cork. And he in turn sold onto Boyle. So Boyle, it seems, had set his sights on Gookin's land previous to this. Boyle was an incredibly powerful figure at this stage. He had arrived in Ireland in the late 1500s and worked initially as an official in the English administration. By the 1620s, he had amassed a vast land bank and was by far the wealthiest of the New English settlers. And we know from an entry in his very detailed diary that he had purchased Gookin's interest in Carrigaline in 1620, but then leased it back to Gookin. The lease was renewed in 1623 for 18 years, but in an interesting note in Boyle's diary says that Gookin was to keep the house and 660 acres of the best land free in his own occupation. So the use of the word house there instead of castle would suggest to me that the house was already built at this stage. So even though we have no conclusive evidence to say for certain that this was so, it certainly seems to me that the house was built most likely by Gookin sometime between 1616 when he first acquired the land and 1623, the date of his lease to Boyle. Now there is another interpretation of the house and another suggestion that it was built in fact by Boyle for his son Francis, and this is based on the Down Survey map. These are maps of Ireland produced in the years 1656 to 58. And this one for the barony of Carrigaline indeed shows a fine house here at Carrigaline. And the accompanying description states that the most considerable place in this barony is at Carrigaline, it being the seat of Francis Boyle, son to the Earl of Cork. And its location would suggest that it is at Carrigaline Castle. But we know from other evidence that Francis Boyle's house was located somewhere to the north of modern Carrigaline town. Boyle was Boyle Jr., Francis Boyle was the Earl of Shannon, and his house was certainly at the place known today as Shannon Park, here to the north of the town. So we return now to Gookin's house, as I do believe it is. And as I mentioned, of course, we looked at this earlier, it's extensively ruined, just the east and the south walls. We know that it's obvious that this wall continued further north. Here we have the ingoing of a door here. So obviously this wall continued further to the west. And we really don't know what it looked like originally, how big it was. But I have suggested in my ground plan that it took this form, which we would call today a U-shaped plan. And I've based this on these two here. This is Coolalong Castle near Durras in West Cork, and this is Coppinger's Court Castle near Roscarbery, also in West Cork. Now, both of these were built in the early 1600s. So I would suggest this is my drawing of reconstruction drawing of Carrigaline, suggested it took this form. A surprising, I'll just come back to that in a moment, a surprising feature of Carrigaline is that there are no defensive features, no gun loops, no matriculations, which you would expect. Now, it's possible that there were defensive features in the missing section. I mean, all we have surviving is this portion here at the southeast. So it's possible that there could have been bartizans, matriculations here at the corners, gun loops, if this was the entrance door, and that they have all collapsed. It also may well have been that Gookin depended more on the nearby castle. If the castle was still serviceable at that stage, which it may well have been, and still usable for defence. Up until the 17th century, the principal dwellings of the elites in Irish society were tower houses such as these. And the striking thing in these tower houses is the height, the verticality, the tiny narrow windows, inside stone vaults, steep stairs, very thick walls. This one is, by the way, is at Cloughlea near Kilworth in North Cork. Now, after the upheavals of the 16th century and the decisive Battle of Kinsale, there occurred what several historians have referred to as a revolution in Irish society, a 40-year period of peace which witnessed an economic, cultural and social revolution. It was also the era when a new form of architecture began to multiply in the Irish rural landscape. It was a period of remarkable growth in economic activity, expansion in agriculture and trade, and phenomenal growth in exports and imports through the port cities like Cork, associated with expanding transatlantic links between England, Cork, and the new colonies of Virginia. Many of the new English settlers in Ireland prospered well from this trade, as indeed did the old urban elites of Cork and other port towns, and indeed some small number, though, of rural-based native Irish elites who participated in the plantations. These groups were the builders of this new architecture, reflecting their newfound prosperity and their adoption of a new forward-looking lifestyle, a lifestyle which was becoming increasingly English. This is Mallow Castle, as it's called, on the site of an old Fitzgerald castle. That so happens it was built by a senior English administrator, so Thomas Norris, built in the 1590s, so making it one of the first, probably the first, of these new fortified houses, as we call them, in Munster. So what you notice, of course, straight away is the horizontality of the buildings by comparison with the height of the tower houses, and the extensive fenestration, even near ground level, much greater number of windows, larger windows. So these were built more for comfort and defense. Inside was wooden floors throughout, no stone walls, no stone vaults, fireplaces on every level, a very different type of building to that which went before. Another one not too far from Mallow, this is Kanturk, slightly more elaborate style. This was actually built by a native Irish chieftain, MacDonagh McCarthy. It was reportedly never finished because the Queen found out he was building it and ordered him to cease. Not sure whether that is true or not. It's likely to have been built after the death of Queen Elizabeth. But again, you see the difference with again the windows, the fireplaces inside. Here we have Monkstown, not far from Carrigaline. This was built by the archdeacons, one of the old merchant elites of Cork City. Again, well furnished with corner bartizans, one on each corner, gun loops here in the bartizans, gun loops around the doors, some of the windows. And another one at a much simpler design, more like a simple based more like a farmhouse of the 19th century, except a little bit bigger, but again with the corner baptisans, gun loops around the windows. This was built by another English settler, Sir Thomas Crook, who established a town here in Baltimore, built, I think, in the first decade of the 17th century. Of course, the fenestration, the thin walls, the lack of internal vaults, all made these houses susceptible to attack and destruction, much weaker and less defensible than the tower houses before them. Many of their owners may have regretted this when war broke out again in the 1640s, and indeed one owner in County Kerry bitterly complained that he had built for peace, having more windows than walls, and he found it indefensible now when war broke out again. So this then was the context and background in which Daniel Gookin built his house here at Carrigaline. It was seen to have been a very simple form with no obvious defences apart maybe from its location. It could be taken to suggest that Gookin was a man who was secure in his tenure and confident in the peace that prevailed at the time. And of course, it may be that the castle nearby was still serviceable as a secure retreat when needed. So the story of Carrigaline Castle and of Daniel Gookin's house seems to have come to an end in and around 1630, when Gookin abandoned Carrigaline and moved into Cork City, and the house was probably not lived in after that. In 1700, the Protestant Bishop of Cork wrote, "Not far from Carrigaline is the old castle of Carrigaline. It is almost ruinous." He makes no mention of the house, which suggests that it was uninhabited at the time. Writing almost 50 years later, the historian Charles Smith said of the castle, "In Queen Elizabeth's time it was called the impregnable castle of Carrigaline, but it is now entirely demolished." Fortunately, Smith's assessment was not accurate, and we have this important, though neglected, ruin to remind us of Carrigaline's role in Irish history and in the origins of the modern city of Newport News. And of course, maritime links between Cork Harbour and the United States have continued, most famously through the famine ships of the 19th century, and of course the Titanic in 1912, and indeed 3 years later, the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, which went down just 11 miles off the coast of County Cork, not too far from Carrigaline. One of those who lost his life in that tragedy was Albert L. Hopkins, president of the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. I will conclude with that, and with the hope that future contacts between Cork and Newport News will be of a happier nature. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so our second speaker today is Hank Lutton. Hank is a curator at Grave Creek Mound Archaeological Complex at Moundsville, West Virginia. He is a registered professional archaeologist with 21 years of experience who specializes in historical archaeology, particularly the artifacts, lifeways, and landscapes of the colonial and early republic periods of the Chesapeake Bay regions. He has directed major urban excavations at Yorktown, Hampton, and Williamsburg, Virginia, where he investigated town formation and urbanization from the late 17th century onwards. His paper today focuses on the history and context of Newport News in Virginia.
Heaven and Earth Never Agreed Better, The History and Context of Newport News, Virginia, by Hank D. Lutton. Good morning. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to Dr. Hiram Morgan for his generous invitation to participate in this exciting 400th anniversary webinar on Ireland, Virginia connections. I also want to thank David Heffernan for dauntlessly providing logistics. Two, I want to acknowledge the graciousness of my colleagues on Greenwich Mean Time for selflessly sacrificing their Saturday afternoon and evening so we Yanks can preserve our early evening cocktail hours. Thank you. My goal today is to present a brief primer on the history of Newport News and how it developed within the context of Virginia's lower tidewater. Due to the lack of a comprehensive, systematic archaeological survey of Newport News, this paper unfortunately relies mostly on documentary resources. I hope this context is relevant to enhancing transatlantic scholarship and fostering a dialogue between ongoing scholarship in the cities of Cork and Newport News. On 30 April 1607, 3 vessels chartered by the Virginia Company of London approached a prominent point of land on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. While exploring the area 2 days earlier in a shallop, Captain Christopher Newport, admiral of the 3-ship squadron, identified a westward channel past the point. Weary from their transatlantic trek, the admiral and those bent to the oars of the shallop found that their discovery of the channel put them in good comfort. This place was dubbed Point Comfort, which is known today as Old Point Comfort, and in the local vernacular as merely Old Point. So this is the landform of Old Point. They would have come in through this channel, and this entire body of water is Hampton Roads. And so on the 30th day of April, 3 boatloads of stinking and ship-worn men sailed past Old Point into Hampton Roads, one of the world's largest natural harbors. After spending the day entertained by the indigenous Kecoughtan near Old Point, the soon-to-be Jamestown colonists sailed westward across Hampton Roads. A tidal estuary by strict definition, the roadstead is formed by the convergence of multiple rivers with the James River. Among these, the Nansemond, Elizabeth, and Hampton rivers. Those aboard who recorded their impressions, like George Percy and John Smith, described an immense roadstead with lush tidal marshes and waters teeming with a seemingly inexhaustible supply of mollusks, crustaceans, waterfowl, and fish, such as the immense Atlantic sturgeon. John Smith wrote, "There is but one entrance by sea in this country, and that is at the mouth of a very goodly bay, 18 or 20 miles broad. Within is a country that may have the prerogative over the most pleasant place ever known. For large and pleasant navigable rivers, heaven and earth never agreed better to frame a place for man's habitation." At the westward edge of the roadstead, the 3 ships charted a northwesterly course to remain in the James Channel and rounded a point that would soon be known as Newport News Point. Although extremely fertile ground, Newport News remained largely beyond the pale during the early years of the Virginia Company. Anglo occupation remained concentrated at Jamestown and several strategic locations such as Fort Algernon, located at Old Point. In 1610, after the Kecoughtan were treacherously dispossessed of their village, cornfields, and strawberry banks, great numbers of colonists relocated to the area between Hampton River and Fort Algernon. where newly arrived colonists recuperated from the perilous crossing and gorged on seafood and strawberries while keeping watch for sails on the eastern horizon. In 1619, the Virginia Company created 4 ill-defined jurisdictions for political and ecclesiastical administration. Among them was the Corporation of Elizabeth City, which encompassed all of modern-day Hampton and Newport News. The incorporation comprised of settlements termed hundreds and plantations. At this point, the Virginia Company began to issue land grants in areas previously untenable. Upon the arrival of Sir Thomas Newce, Marshal of Virginia, in October 1621, Newce was awarded some of the most coveted riverfront acreage in and around Newport News Point. However, Sir William perished within 2 months, and it is likely that his grant was taken up by Daniel Gookin, who arrived well-provisioned aboard the Flying Hart in late November 1621. From this point onward, documents often refer to Gookin's plantation as Newport Newce. In 1633, Peter de Vries, a Dutch shipmaster, recorded anchoring at Newport Snoo, where he filled the casks of a ship with sweet spring water and advertised all ships to do so. One possible archaeological indication of Gookin's occupation are numerous tobacco pipes and North Italian marbleized slipware now in the collection of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Dating to the first half of the 17th century, Dr. Jerome Knowles collected the artifacts eroding from an embankment of the James near Newport News Point. After the dissolution of the charter of the Virginia Company of London, the Crown reorganized Anglo-occupied lands in Virginia into 8 shires or counties. The area previously known as the Corporation of Elizabeth City was subdivided. The eastern portion became Elizabeth City County, later the City of Hampton, and the western portion became Warwick County, later the City of Newport News. In the mid-20th century, the counties of Elizabeth City and Newport News ceased to exist when they were subsumed by urbanization and reconstituted as the cities of Hampton and Newport News. So this is the area that is Elizabeth City County that becomes Hampton. This area, which is Warwick County, becomes Newport News. A muster taken in the aftermath of the 1622 Powhatan attack indicates that most of the population of the Virginia Company lived in or had retreated to the area today designated as Newport News and Hampton. For most of the 17th century, the Chesapeake was a region without an urban landscape. The documentary record leaves us with the impression that virtually every literate European who ventured to the Chesapeake decried the lack of towns and committed their observations just as soon as quill and ink were at hand. Despite pronouncements of Canaan-like bounty and the promise of seemingly boundless land to cultivate, English investors and Crown officials were ill at ease with the lack of urban improvements. Many in Virginia and England shared the belief that urbanization was essential to attract an artisan class and to provide infrastructure for industrial development. But this was at odds with the plantation system of indentured servitude and chattel slavery. Historian Paul Musselwhite has described this tense reality as urban dreams, rural commonwealth. During the second and third quarters of the 17th century, the colonial governors of Virginia attempted to stimulate economic diversification at Jamestown as a means of achieving urban development. Jamestown is located right here. Implemented in jolting fits and starts, these endeavors to transform Jamestown from a political seat of scant urbanity to the metropolis of His Majesty's country were never realized. As the agrarian colony's population dispersed beyond the James River basin, colonial administrators struggled with how a single entrepot at Jamestown could enforce the provision of Parliament's increasingly restrictive navigation acts. The practice of vessels breaking bulk at plantations and communities before they ever docked at Jamestown brought handsome profits to mariners and coveted goods and provision for settlers. And the statutes authorized in Jamestown or London could not dissuade the practice. In an effort to regulate incoming commerce and tobacco exports, a series of largely redundant laws were enacted. What emerged by legislative fiat during the waning years of the 17th century were county port towns that only prospered if their mandated location coincided with economic viability. Among the most successful of these ports were Hampton, Norfolk, and Yorktown. Those were closest to shipping lanes of the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic. With a burgeoning shipbuilding and repair industry and communities of sailors, these ports flourished as commercial hubs in urban centers with which other county ports could not compete. Port Warwick, which served Newport News Point, consisted of little more than a jail, courthouse, tavern, tobacco warehouses, and perhaps a merchant's shop. Throughout the colonial period, grand waterfront plantations, such as Matthews Manor, also known as Denby Plantation, and Sealy Plantation, were associated with Newport News. Renowned for lavish entertainment and owned by some of the most politically powerful men of the Virginia colony, these plantations were atypical. In actuality, most plantations in the area were substantially smaller and often had little or no river frontage. Due to early settlement patterns and the constrained size of the original counties, land holdings tended to be considerably smaller compared to those in counties formed later in the 17th and 18th centuries. During the American Revolution and the War of 1812, Newport News remained a breadbasket that armies and navies relied upon and pillaged. It was also a strategic location on which the Royal Navy repeatedly landed soldiers and Marines to outflank defending forces or imperil communications between Williamsburg and the towns of Virginia's lower tidewater. Despite the deprivations committed by British redcoats, Marines, and mercenaries, the area was spared from major battles and wholesale devastation. The first modern change to the role of Newport News arrived with the American Civil War. Federal forces at Fort Monroe on Old Point occupied Newport News Point and constructed Camp Butler. After the burning of Hampton, the Battle of Williamsburg, and the great naval battle of the American Civil War, the Battle of Hampton Roads, military action on the lower tidewater of Virginia diminished, but the strain of military occupation continued. After the war, the farms of Newport News and their oyster beds lay in ruin. With titles and most properties in disarray, many tracts were auctioned off for back taxes. Nevertheless, enterprising capitalists saw an opportunity to invest after the war. Among them was Collis P. Huntington. In 1869, Huntington formed the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad from an existing network of railroads and extended it west to the Ohio River before initiating his ambitious scheme to expand the railroad eastward to a deep water port. Coal from the bituminous coal fields of West Virginia was the chief business of the Chesapeake and Ohio. To access lucrative coastal and overseas markets, Huntington needed an Atlantic port for the eastern terminus. Hampton Roads offered every advantage: a wide, deep natural harbor with ice-free anchorage in winter, protection from summer and autumn storms, and a short passage across the Chesapeake Bay to the Atlantic Ocean. On the southeastern rim of Hampton Roads, the port of Norfolk had prospered since the 18th century. Canal barges and rail lines delivered cotton, grain, timber, pork, and naval stores from nearby North Carolina to Norfolk's ports for coastal and overseas markets. But Navy shipyards in the thriving cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth occupied the premium locations on the Elizabeth River, which was increasingly congested with ships. Huntington, too, was aware that the use of Norfolk as a terminus required the costly expense to either bridge Hampton Roads or the James River. Acquiring the farms of Newport Newce at minimal cost not only eliminated the need to clear forest, but also eliminated an additional water crossing, and it provided Huntington with direct access to what historian and journalist Park S. Rouse Jr. dubbed the Endless Harbor. As early as 1872, Huntington's agents began discreetly acquiring land. Just as Huntington had created a planned town audaciously named after himself on the banks of the Ohio River in West Virginia, he created another from the agricultural fields of Newport News in 1881. The booming industrial center emerged at an astonishing rate, complete with rail yards, coal terminals, and massive grain elevators. Within a few years, Huntington constructed a ship repair facility known today as Newport News Shipbuilding. The combination of coal sales to the ocean steaming vessels of the world and construction of the military vessels at the shipyard spurred the growth of Newport News, which was incorporated in 1896. By the time of America's entry into the Great War, Newport News was a major shipping port. During the Great War, more than 250,000 soldiers departed Newport News for Europe, along with 4 million tons of supplies and nearly 500,000 horses and mules. To commemorate the embarkation and return of soldiers and sailors, local citizens funded and constructed the World War I Victory Monument. More than 400,000 American soldiers returned to the U.S. via Newport News. In addition to ship construction and repair, Newport News contributed to the fledgling American aviation industry. Glenn Curtiss established the Atlantic Coast Aeronautical Station and the Curtiss Flying School on a 20-acre tract of land east of Newport News Boat Harbor in the fall of 1915. Many civilian students, including Canadians, later became military aviators in the Great War. In 1917, the U.S. Army took over training operations. Among those who became certified pilots here were ballroom dancer Vernon Castle of the Vernon and Irene Castle duo, and General Billy Mitchell, the dauntless advocate of American air power. The school was disbanded in 1922. As with the Great War, the Second World War ushered in a period of unprecedented growth for the military industry in Newport News. The city grew from a population of 37,000 inhabitants to more than 100,000, which brought hardships and scarcities of a distorted economy. As a port of embarkation, more than 1.6 million persons, that includes embarkees, debarkees, and prisoners of war, passed through Newport News. Newport News shipbuilding continued producing numerous vessels, from Liberty ships to capital ships such as 14 aircraft carriers of the Essex class. The shipyard's reputation was firmly established when it launched in 1951 the luxurious liner SS United States, the last winner of the coveted Blue Riband for fastest crossing of the Atlantic. Although my colleagues in this webinar have committed themselves to revealing transatlantic connections between Ireland and Virginia, the bonds between these two lands and our people are not limited merely to the colonial period. 300 years after the arrival of Daniel Gookin, another ship bore intrepid Irish travelers to Newport News. On 4 January 1921, West Cannon, a freighter laden with a cargo of lime rock, arrived in Newport News from Cork. Authorities soon apprehended and jailed 2 stowaways, Donald O'Callaghan, Lord Mayor of Cork, and Peter McSweeney, brother of the late Terence McSweeney, who preceded O'Callaghan as Lord Mayor of Cork, and who died on the 74th day of a hunger strike while imprisoned for sedition. Shortly after the burning of Cork during 11-12 December 1920, McSweeney and O'Callaghan, who feared he would not be issued documents to travel to the United States, eluded watchful eyes and stowed away aboard West Cannon while she was moored in Cork. Just as soon as the vessel passed the 3-mile territorial limit of Great Britain, the stowaways presented themselves to the captain. The destination of West Cannon was well selected, as it was an easy rail trip from Newport News to Washington, D.C., where both men were invited to testify before the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland. However, the men were briefly detained by authorities in Newport News, beginning what was a media coup, as newspapers and radio broadcasts across the United States carried the story of their desperate Atlantic passage and brief jailing. Both men testified effectively before the commission. Lord Mayor Donald O'Callaghan is second from the left. Peter McSweeney is second from the right. Between them is their sponsor and commission member, Senator George W. Norris. They were joined by Jeremiah Dempsey, mayor of Mallow, on the far right. Unfortunately, I have yet to learn by what means O'Callaghan and McSweeney returned to Cork, but I certainly hope their accommodations were more befitting on the return. In more recent times, the City of Newport News has taken a leadership role with historic preservation on the Virginia Peninsula. The city acquired 18th century Enview Plantation, pre-Civil War Lee Hall Mansion, and the Victorian Newsom House Museum and Cultural Center, highlighting the area's diverse and rich history. Newport News also preserves the 1810 and 1884 Warwick courthouses, Young's Mill, and unstaffed historic sites that are part of the Virginia Civil War trails. Newport News has preserved substantial amounts of green space and is a strong partner in heritage tourism and museums. It is home to the 90-year-old Mariners Museum and Park, as well as the Peninsula Fine Arts Center, Virginia Living Museum, Virginia War Museum, the U.S. Army Transportation Museum, and the circa 1725 Matthew Jones House. Hilton Village, the charming neighborhood of cottages next to the James River, where author William Styron grew up, remains largely unchanged from when it was built for shipyard workers in 1918 as the nation's first federal war housing project. Far from being a tourism advert, I believe this demonstrates the commitment of Newport News to historic preservation and sharing its heritage. Along with institutions of higher learning, such as the College of William and Mary, Christopher Newport University, Hampton University, and Norfolk State, there are numerous institutions with which to partner in transatlantic collaborations. Through partnerships, we can identify the bonds, now 4 centuries old, that have and continue to connect us. As Dorothy Rouse Bottom, a local journalist, historian, and philanthropist, observed, the horizon of a maritime community allows strangers to come from afar, where people might imagine themselves to be whomsoever they wish to be within the order of the created world. Together, we can illuminate our origins and the transformative power of time, place, and people. Thank you.